In mid-February of 1945, Courbet's The Stonebreakers, along with 154 other artworks, was carried out from the Semper Gallery in Dresden and loaded onto one of the waiting lorries outside the Zwinger Palace. It began its journey to be stored at the hilltop Königsberg fortress, just 20 or so miles to the southeast of the city. It never arrived, as an Allied wave of bombers arrived first, and the convoy was destroyed in the mass destruction of the city and its inhabitants. The painting had been created in the wake of the 1848 revolution in France. The Louvre Salon that year had abolished the jury, and hence all works were admitted. In 1849, encouraged by the acceptance of 2 works to the Salon held in the Tuileries that year, Courbet painted The Stonebreakers, a work which Linda Nochlin describes as being the real fulfillment of the ideals of 1848, and the work was exhibited in the Salon of 1850 in the Palais Royal. However, the controversy aroused by the work and the conservatism of the regime that swept aside the Second Republic led to Courbet's abandoning the Salon 5 years later to set up his own alternative salon, the Pavillon du Réalisme. The wedge that Courbet drove with that action between state-sanctioned art and the modern independent artist paved the way for the Salon des Refusés of 1863 and the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874. However, Courbet was an activist in the Paris Commune of 1871, and his was the recommendation to destroy Napoleon Bonaparte's Vendôme column and destroy the house of the chief executive of state Adolphe Thiers and confiscate his art collection. After the Commune fell and Thiers' authority was reimposed, Courbet was imprisoned, and then, from 1873, exiled to Switzerland, where he drank himself to his death in 1877. Other artists associated with the Realist movement, such as Corot and Millet, retained romantic elements, eternal ideals of the beauty of nature or its ageless relationship with rural workers, and did this primarily through the landscape. Courbet's work represents a stronger rejection of romantic idealism. The Stonebreakers, for example, does this by focusing on the foreground subject of workers' subjugation, almost to the exclusion of any landscape or skyscape behind, and by using the palette knife to draw attention to the paint as material, refuting as illusion any representation of the transcendental, so much so that the term materialist was used by Courbet's critics to describe his art. The anarchist philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, also from Franche-Comté, and whom Courbet painted or drew several times, described Courbet's The Bathers in terms of this rejection of pure idealism for materialism. As the art historian Arnold Hauser puts it, in the eyes of Proudhon and Courbet, realism and political rebellion are different expressions of the same attitude, and they see no essential difference between social and artistic truth. Gustave Courbet was born into a family of affluent farmers in Ornans, in the independent-minded region of Franche-Comté, about 20 miles from the Swiss border. He showed an early interest in painting, learning to paint en plein air from a local painter, before travelling to Paris to study under Baron von Steuben, and at the less formal academy run by a former model by the name of Suisse. Among Courbet's early works were the self-portraits just seen, including his first salon acceptance after 3 years of rejections, Self-Portrait with Black Dog. Despite Courbet's attempts to please by using a glossy romantic style, it was one of only 5 works accepted by the Salon before 1848. As the 1840s progressed, so did political agitation against the monarchical regime, and Courbet became more radical, developing the realist style for which he would become known, associating in the Brasserie Andler with other like-minded artists and the anarchist philosopher Proudhon. Then came the salons of 1849 and 1850, After Dinner at Ornans and Valley of the Loue, and the following year The Funeral at Ornans and The Stonebreakers. After dinner at Ornans shows, from left to right, the artist's father Régis, a glass of spirits in his hand, his head lowered with drowsiness as he listens to the music. Next to him, the house owner, Urbain Queneau, a friend of Courbet's, is also lost in the music. With his back to us and lighting his pipe is Courbet's friend Marlet, returned from the hunt, and another friend, Promaillet, is playing the violin. The subject, of simple rural life in a stone-floored, low-beamed cottage, is typical of genre painting, but one of the most striking features of After Dinner at Ornans was its size. Just under 2 meters high by over 2.5 meters wide, a size normally reserved for the genre of history painting. In other words, Courbet is subverting the academic hierarchy, which saw the noble and heroic as distinct from commonplace rural life. For Courbet, the people, not the nobility, were heroic. The facture of the painting also emphasizes this. Instead of the bright palette of idealized romanticism or classicism, Courbet has used a rough finish of earth tones, darkened with tar. Seeing the painting, a critic accused Courbet of dragging art into the gutter, to which Courbet replied, "Yes, art must be dragged into the gutter." Delacroix praised the work's independence, calling it revolutionary. Importantly for Courbet's career, in 1849 he was awarded a silver medal by the state, which meant that he was exempt thereafter from jury rejections. In September of 1848, the first body was buried in the new cemetery just outside Ornans to the southwest, and this canvas is a view of that burial in the cemetery, with the town of Ornans and the river Leu behind the Meuse, looking northwards towards the cliffs to the north of town. The very fact of the burial was a victory for any independent-minded citizens of Ornans, as the church had resisted the new cemetery, preferring instead to restrict burials to its own jurisdiction, the churchyard in the town. The body buried was that of Claude Etienne Teste, Courbet's great-uncle, and Courbet, having come to Ornans after the death of his grandfather the previous month, likely attended Teste's funeral, and in 1849 Courbet began to paint A Burial at Ornans. As with Dinner after Ornans, the painting is of a size previously reserved for the historical genre, over 6.5 meters wide, but the figures portrayed are the real citizens of Ornans, with no central hero, all playing their part. The front pallbearer is the violin player Promaillet, the abbé's name is Benjamin Bonnet, there are 2 deacons, one a wine grower, one a shoemaker, and the mayor, Claude Hélène Prosper Teste, is a relative of the deceased. The figure on the extreme left of the canvas is the grandfather, Oudot, who had died before Teste in August of the same year, and in whose house Courbet painted A Burial at Ornans. Of this work, Courbet said that it was the burial of Romanticism. In this context, the use of the same tones and facture for the earth of the open grave, the skull by it, and the procession of mourners implies that they are of the same substance, corruptible matter devoid of a transcendental soul. Although Courbet died near Lake Geneva in Switzerland, his remains were moved to the cemetery in Ornans in 1919. The Stonebreakers was described by the historian T.J. Clarke as the last revolutionary painting ever to be made. It's a representation of hard and low-paid labour. In contrast to the previous agrarian economy of crop sharing for reward of labour, workers such as stonebreakers, who were paid a daily wage, were a symptom of a new economic phase, and were often rural workers who had been forced off of farms through mechanization. Courbet has emphasized the mechanical nature of their work by hiding the workers' faces and presenting the synchronized angularity of their bodies. Proudhon spoke of the picture as representing the modern servitude of industrial civilization, and Courbet, in a letter to Champfleury, how it represented something taken literally from life. "I have made none of it up, dear friend. I saw these people every day on my walk." But Courbet, through his realist composition and paint facture, has prevented any idealization. Firstly, the composition, very similar to Millet's The Sower of the same year, presents the workers in a shadowed valley, which emphasizes the workers who fill the foreground. But whereas the small sunlit oxen covering the seeds in Millet's work speak of the promise of a future harvest, in Courbet's work the tiny landscape and sky offer no ideal world beyond. The sunlight falls on a solid cliff face of unbreakable looking rock, an object of despair for a stonebreaker. James H. Rubin refers to the anti-hierarchical and materialistic style, with the paint facture of the entire canvas drawing equal attention to itself as material, and which prevents any recourse to nature to find transcendental values. Given that wrestlers in French, les lutteurs, can also be translated as strugglers, the subject immediately takes on overtones of political struggle. With the wrestlers, Courbet developed the theme of the rural dispossessed by looking at a profession common with rural migrant workers, but by setting it in an upper-class urban context, the imperial hippodrome. Courbet has chosen to create a work of juxtaposition of rich and poor. The juxtaposition is also made manifest in the facture of the painting, with the foregrounded wrestlers filling the frame of the nearly 3-meter high canvas, their muscles and veins painted to emphasize their physicality, and yet rendered through the unorthodox method of overpainting in a wearied greyish tone, in contrast with the luminous gaiety of the background. This unreal juxtaposition was criticized as looking like a poster, and it is precisely this unreality which Courbet has aimed at, this incongruity of hardship and ease. The full title of The Artist's Studio is The Studio of the Painter, a Real Allegory Determining 7 Years of My Life as an Artist. At 361 centimeters in height, it's taller than the burial at Ornans. Courbet was elusive regarding its allegorical meaning. He worked largely from previously made portraits, including the central self-portrait, based on a self-portrait from the previous year. In a letter to Champfleury of 1854, he identified the two groups in the painting as, on the right, all the shareholders, that is to say friends, fellow workers and art lovers. On the left is the other world of commonplace life, the masses, wretchedness, poverty, wealth, the exploited and the exploiters, people who live on death. Courbet describes the group on the left in terms of general types, hunter, strongman, clown, and so on, but identifies his friends on the right, including people from After Dinner at Ornans, the philosopher Proudhon, and the writer Baudelaire. In another letter to the painter Francais of 1855 regarding the meaning of the painting, he stated guardedly, "It's all rather mysterious. It's anybody's guess." However, from the various contexts of the work, a more specific allegory emerges. Firstly, there is the imperial propaganda of Napoleon III's Exposition Universelle of 1855, intended to rival London's Great Exhibition of 1851. And secondly, Napoleon III's military involvement in 1854 in the Crimean War. And there are obvious likenesses in Courbet's canvas of various figures associated with Napoleon III's government. Napoleon III himself is presented in the foreground as a poacher, having stolen democracy from the French people. Various ministers in his government or supporters of it are lampooned. The person Courbet describes as a Jew that he met in London is in fact the Frenchman Achille Fould, a Jewish banker instrumental in the industrial expansion of the Second Empire, which the Exposition Universelle promoted. The priest is Louis Veuillot, an ultra-Catholic royalist journalist. Lazare Carnot was Minister of the Interior under Napoleon I. The fabric salesman is a likeness of the journalist Émile de Girardin. The undertaker resembles the Count de Persigny, Napoleon III's Minister of the Interior. The skull next to him rests on a copy of the Journal des Débats, a publication that had been highly critical of Courbet. The figures at the back, the hunter and the reaper, the workman and his wife, are associated with nationalist leaders or independence movements in nations who looked to Napoleon III for support. The Irish woman brings associations with the Great Famine. Of the assembled shareholders on the right, Courbet's letter to Champfleury did not name his former mistress, Virginie Binet, with her new husband, nor did it mention his patrons, the Sabatiers. A figure next to Baudelaire has been overpainted, probably his mistress. The year before the Exposition Universelle, the superintendent of the fine arts, M. Nieuwerkerk, had approached Courbet on Napoleon III's behalf to commission a painting from him for the exposition. Courbet refused, but the encounter prompted him to paint the artist's studio, which he never submitted to the official salon. Courbet set up his pavillon de Realism instead, and changed the course of art history.